for including Palestine. Our speakers today will be expanding on these issues and much more. I want to give a special shout out to the Arab Resource and Organizing Center for co-sponsoring today's webinar. I also want to give a quick thank you to my NAAWA colleagues in the EOP program who have helped to organize this event. And a special thank you to NAAWA's Program Outreach Coordinator and Associate, Lara Kiswani, who has made this event possible and is helping with the behind the scenes tech today. Thanks, Lara. And I'll quickly go over the format for today's webinar. Each of the speakers will be given 15 minutes to present, and after all of the speakers have presented, we'll go into Q&A with the audience. We ask that you please submit your questions to the Q&A chat box, not the comment box. Please note, the webinar is being recorded for those who would like to share with others who were not able to join us today. And we're also live streaming on NAAWA's Facebook page. So feel free to share the link with folks there too. The webinar, we should be closing today around 5:30 p.m. Eastern time and 2:30 p.m. Pacific time. And just one quick plug for an upcoming event that NAAWA's hosting. Be sure to follow NAAWA's social media page to get the latest updates about our upcoming virtual annual gala taking place on March 7th. We're thrilled to have Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar and many more joining us for this virtual event. Yara will go ahead and add NAAWA's information and links and handles in the chat box for those who want to get more involved and learn more. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce our speakers that we have today, who we're so grateful and excited to have with us. First, we have Dr. Tiffany Mitchell Patterson, who is an assistant professor of secondary social studies at West Virginia University in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction Literacy Studies. Prior to joining West Virginia University, she taught upper elementary and middle school social studies for 10 years in Washington, D.C. and Arlington, Virginia. Mitchell Patterson earned her doctorate in multilingual and multicultural education and education policy from George Mason University. Her research interests include racial and social justice in education, education activism, critical civic education, teaching Black and unrepresented narratives in social studies. Advocacy, activism, intersectionality, and anti-racist bias, oppressive education lies at the core of her research and teaching practice. Education is her revolution. Next, we have Lara Kiswani. Lara Kiswani is from Beit Iqsa and Akir in Palestine and was born and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area. She has been active in movements against war, Palestinian determination, and Third World solidarity for the last 20 years. She is a faculty member at San Francisco State University in the College of Ethnic Studies and is the executive director of the Arab Resource and Organizing Center, or AROC. Lara earned her master's in education with an emphasis on equity and social justice, where her work focused on young Arab women, language, and colonization. And next we have Dr. Theresa Montano, who is a professor of Chicano and Chicano studies with an emphasis in education at California State University, Northridge. She is also co-chair of the Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum Coalition and was a member of California's Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum Advisory Committee. Dr. Montano has more than 40 years in public education. She taught 15 years in K-12 schools with an emphasis in education at California State University, Northridge. As an active unionist, Montano is the former CTA vice president and active in the California Faculty Association. Her publications include 2 co-edited books, several research publication essays, and curriculum units. So thank you so much. And if I butchered anybody's info in their bios, please feel free to correct them during your presentations. And without further ado, we're going to go ahead and begin with Dr. Tiffany Mitchell Patterson. So the floor is yours.
Peace, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be in solidarity with everyone here and taking that time out. I always say you could be anywhere in the world, but you're here with us. And so I really appreciate that. We were asked to answer some questions, and the questions really about kind of our personal experiences, our teaching experiences, the work that we're doing, and how we've come to this work. And so I love that because this is personal. This is something that I say I'm not new to this. I'm true to this. You know, you're born into the revolution in this work. When I think about, I am from Hampton, Virginia, which is maybe about 20 minutes from Jamestown settlement, right? So this is what they like to say, the first permanent settlement of English colony, right? But we know that this is founded on white supremacy, colonization, and violence. And this type of knowledge is not directly taught, right? So they don't even talk about this when you're born and from Virginia. So my kind of first foray into this was they take everybody on a fourth grade field trip to Jamestown. You know, you go, you see the fort, and they're talking about these English settlers, and they're making the little cornbread and all that little stuff, right? This is the interactive trip. I will say now Jamestown has improved since then, but this was in the 90s. I came home from the field trip and my mother said, "So who did you see on the field trip? Who did you see any indigenous people, see any Native Americans?" "Oh, I think it was somebody maybe dressed up." "Did you see anybody that was enslaved? Did you see anybody that was?" "Well, no, I think someone had an outfit, but they didn't really speak, at that time." And she said, "Okay, put your shoes on. We getting ready to go outside." We walk outside and she starts pointing at the street signs that are named Kickingham. Why do you think these names, why do you think this is named this? I had no idea that I was on the land of the Kickingham. And she was like, "This is their land. They stole it. Here's the street sign. But you didn't learn nothing about that." This is me at fourth grade. So as you can see, my mother was really oriented into making sure that, and she told me, you can't expect to learn about your history and the history of other people in schools. So now it's time for you to start noticing this. And those teachings continued. And I really began to get probably radicalized when in sixth grade, I was reading like Babysitter's Club and all of that, because you didn't really see this. They didn't talk about this in school. And she said, "Well, maybe let's try to read this." And it was like the autobiography of Malcolm X. And we read it together. And through that, she said, "Now it's time that you start really learning about your history and where you come from and who you are and the type of peoples you're connected to." But she was very clear in always saying that the plight of Black people is not just here, it's around the world, but also we are connected in the struggle with oppressed people around the world. And you being a woman, you are also connected to another struggle, right? So she was really orienting me into womanism and Black feminism and what it meant to at a very early age. And so those teachings that I received outside of school allowed me to be able to see history in a new way. And social studies remained my favorite subject. I still am teaching it now, but because of that pushback of those other stories that are that need to be told, that should be told. When I think about the what was missing and inaccuracies in the curriculum, I would say everybody first. They don't teach everybody, but I also want to recognize that these we think about these multiple identities of people. You never got this fullness of experience of peoples. It was the singular identity if you got it. That was really reductionist. I think about even now and thinking about Jamestown and how the 1619 project just totally blew up with the 400th anniversary of American enslavement. And I grew up maybe 10 minutes from there. I had been Point Comfort several times, and that history was not ingrained or taught to us. And so, what opportunities are we missing? Hidden figures happening, these powerful, brilliant Black women never heard of, right? And so, my work, it that kind of radicalized me not only as a student, but then as a student activist. So in high school, I really began to say, hey, why are you not talking about this? We need to be talking about this. I got really involved in the city and working with young people across the city. When I went to college, I studied political science. My goal was at the time first to be Shirley Chisholm. And then the more and more I got into it, and I'm reading Angela Davis and all this stuff, I decided, oh no, I'm going to continue to be a revolutionary. So that was my goal and my work in understanding systems. But that's also important to think about teaching system. I was getting this systemic oppression analysis, being poor, being Black, being a woman. I was seeing all of this play out. I was seeing people organizing in my community saying about unfair housing conditions. I was seeing people talking about Reaganomics and what was happening during the crack era. There was this high level of political work happening in Black communities that did not get highlighted in schools, that did not get highlighted in mainstream media. Um, and so I kind of carried that with me. And when I decided to become a teacher, that's the work that I wanted to do. I wanted to be, I said, oh, I could build an army of revolutionaries. So that was like my subversive goal. And I knew that I wouldn't be able to reach everyone, right? But my goal was at least I know that they've heard this once. And the power of my mother's revolutionary teachings, if I could give that to students, what might they do? And it's been phenomenal. And then when I got into the school, I saw that as a system. So the curriculum, oh my God, the social studies curriculum, the history curriculum, extremely problematic, as we know. We think about how so much is reduced, so much is glossed over, so much is not named. There'll be things like, Jim Crow just happened in the South and only to Black peoples, which is, not true. Or there'll be this, we'll talk about the mercantilism and industrial revolution, but the transatlantic slave trade is not in there. I mean, it's like so many things. One glaring example was in sixth grade curriculum on westward expansion about manifest destiny, there was no Trail of Tears. There was very minimal talk of forced Indian removal. And I said, we're not doing that. We teaching these kids. And so much of it is they assumed if students were younger, sixth grade, that they couldn't handle it. In fact, they could. And many of them would say, why didn't nobody tell us this? But you have to do the work to cultivate that environment. And you have to really talk about the ways in which your students need this work. They need to do a systematic analysis and also balancing that with hope. So I always talk to students about in terms of oppression and resistance. So yeah, these people were oppressed, and there were these people that also fought back against that. In periods of injustice, there's always people fighting for justice. And what does justice actually look like? What actually teaching social movements, actually teaching solidarity as a verb, and teaching it as complicated and messy. It's not a kumbaya, everybody come together with the same ideas, and we're going to no, this is contentious. This is hard work. People get tired. People die fighting for what they believe in. And so that really helps students to rush in my class every day. Ooh, what are we going to talk about? Oh my gosh. And also see themselves. I taught in a school called Cesar Chavez, where students all didn't know who Cesar Chavez was or the movement behind him and the cross-racial movement that existed. That's another thing we got to work on, teaching individuals as opposed to people and movements and power. Um, and also thinking about my students from Central and Central America, South America, never got a chance to see themselves. Really tackling Islamophobia. If we think about, I was working on some research on curriculum and looking at the Virginia standards. And so I'll share just a little bit of that data and we could talk a little bit more about it, but this will kind of help bring this point home. White individuals are named 184 times in the Virginia history curriculum. So in history, grades like 4, in middle school and high school. Black individuals named 40 times, like as an individual, just people. Native Americans 5 times, Hawaiian Pacific Islanders 2 times. And think about, Hispanic Latinx 1. So one person, and I guess you can assume who that one person will probably be, Cesar Chavez. And Arab Americans, 0. And even think about how the Middle East is taught and talked about. And, and we think about, we'll be learning about the movement and things that are happening in California, which is even a lot of challenges there in a more progressive state. Think about what's happening here, virtually non-existent, or in the context of Afghanistan, Iraq, right? And that's the only times you hear a student. So we would unpack that and we would talk about Islamophobia, and students would be able to share. And that's the other thing that I really pressed upon in my class. And I said, we can't hit it all, but what I want you to know that the fullness of people's lives, narratives, experiences, contributions, resistance, in large part is erased, ignored, minimized. I actually have students go through the textbook. We do like a scavenger hunt and we talk about who's missing and why this is not a reliable source for us. It's maybe a source, but it's not the source that we need to go to. We need to honor people's stories. We need to honor their lives told through by themselves, right? And we need to continue to uncover that. So doing that work, and that's the work I kind of continue to do with pre-service teachers. So in thinking about what really pushed me to act, it was I came in ready for this revolution in education. And in many ways, I knew the potential of the consequences of it. Would I be fired? Would I be transferred? I was very honest going on job interviews. I am going to be a radical social justice educator. We're going to talk about it. If that is not what you want, then this is not the place for me. Students were extremely receptive to me, and surprisingly, parents were as well. But what really did help me was also getting down with some other teachers, like-minded educators, and those educators being through Teaching for Change, being able to connect with educators through the DC area Educators for Social Justice and Zen Education Project. And then in thinking about as the Black Lives Matter at School movement came, I began to be a part of that. And that really helped to bridge and support me, not as a teacher, being in solidarity and community with others, but also recognizing how we can do this work together. I've served on curriculum committees. Those are a space of, they're traumatic. We could talk about that when y'all ask me, ask some questions, but the curriculum in many ways can be violent, and particularly violent to people that have been marginalized by the system. And so pushing back against that can be challenging. But what I want to say is that this advocacy work does work. We have taken many students down to Capitol Hill to protest different issues. We have many students have engaged. In fact, students reached out to me during the summer, last summer, and they were saying, we're out here organizing. I mean, I taught these kids when they were 11 and 12 and 13. And they said, oh, we're out here organizing for Black Lives Matter, still invested in the movement. Or we're out here fighting for DACA. We're out here fighting for this. And so that lets me see that in many ways, when you do this liberatory work, you do this freedom dreaming work where you show students that, yes, this is the system. Yes, you need to understand it, but also you have a place where you can actually do something about it. And it's going to be hard and it's going to be complicated and you're going to make mistakes and it's going to be messy, but you got to still try. My goodness, that is one of the best things that you can do. And it's just extremely powerful. So that's just a little bit of some of the work I do. I love to go into more and more stories, but I don't want to take up so much time. I think we have some other interesting ways to be organizing. And I love to talk about some of that cross-racial solidarity, some of that interfaith solidarity, some of the ways that we have been able to bring that into the classroom much later. Did
Oh
I
no,
talk too much?
you were excellent. That was an excellent presentation. Thank you so much. And it's a really great uplifting presentation. And thank you so much also, Tiffany, for acknowledging the fact that, we are on Indigenous land. This is stolen land. I think every time we have these conversations, it's definitely important to recognize and not just acknowledge, but that in the same way uplift the fact that we are on Indigenous land. And that is central to the issues that we're talking about today. So thank you. We appreciate that. And next, I'll give the floor to Lara Kiswani. Thank you so much.
And thank you, NAAWA, for hosting this event. It's an honor to be in conversation with these amazing women. I'm gonna, again, as Tiffany mentioned, we were asked to talk about our personal stories and how that relates to the work we do around education and the fights we're involved in. And I'm gonna start by just saying that I'm a child of Palestinian immigrants. I'm the first of my siblings to be born in the United States, and I come from a working class, immigrant, Arab, Muslim, Palestinian family, and all of that really shapes my identity. And it was the experience in the education system that actually planted it in me, an understanding of social and economic justice, and a commitment to fighting it. On a personal level, I didn't see myself or my people in any textbook curriculum. I was told my country doesn't exist. In second grade, when everybody was asked to go point to where their ancestors come from on a world map, and I pointed to where Palestine should have been listed but wasn't, my teacher told me that doesn't exist. There is no such thing as Palestine. And I knew from a very young age that I had to challenge her for that, and I did. And I learned early on that being Palestinian in this world, in the United States in particular, was actually a political act in of itself. And it's an identity that is about resisting erasure, colonialism, and racism. I recall my teachers who inspired me, right? I recall my sixth grade teacher who went off script from the textbook and asked me to teach the unit on Islam to my fellow classmates. And from then on, I decided I wanted to be a teacher and I wanted to pursue work in education, and did so before joining on staff at AROC. I recall my high school US history teacher who photocopied Howard Zinn's A People Histories of the United States, Dee Brown's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, had us watch documentaries about Black Power and Chicano student movements and movements against the war in Vietnam, and how she did so surreptitiously, as if she could get fired at any moment for doing so. We'd have to return the photocopies at the end of the year. But it was those moments and those lessons that taught me about life, about the world, about humanity, and about freedom. And as an organizer with the Arab Resource and Organizing Center, I get to see how our youth leaders have also experienced similar things and taken action to change that, right? So our youth leaders conducted 2 surveys called Turath, which means heritage in Arabic. And it stands for Teaching, Understanding, and Representing Arabs throughout history. As part of their synthesizing the results of those surveys on representation of Arabs and Muslims in high school classrooms, they also analyzed textbooks. And it should come to no surprise that the overall experience of the Arabs in the classroom as it relates to racism, stereotypes, and marginalization correlated with the lack of curriculum and representation in those textbooks, or the content itself, which focused on demonization of Arabs and Muslims. And in their report they just published last year, one of the results is that only 2.3% of the students surveyed learned anything about Arabs and Muslims in school, right? So some things haven't changed, and absent of a systemic overhaul of our current Eurocentric K-12 curriculum, without individual teachers committed to providing alternative social justice-oriented sources and curriculum, or a robust ethnic studies program that is liberatory and transformative, the experience of poor, working class, Black, Brown, Indigenous youth will continue to be disempowering and alienating, because that is how essentially it was designed to be, right? And the erasure of my people and identity in the classroom shaped my commitment to another world. It shaped my commitment to make sure that no other student has to experience that. The way in which I was tracked at a very young age as one of the few students of color in my elementary school and put in an ESL program, although English was one of my first languages. Not knowing why, but knowing it was wrong and racist, right? And it was the teachers who treated me and my people, and all people, with dignity and respect that inspired me, that taught me what solidarity is. It's those teachers that gave me tools to see myself and other oppressed people as agents of change, allow me to feel part of something bigger, of a world that offers me a way to build with other people. It was my experience in ethnic studies courses where I was able to unpack and unlearn structures of power and have access to liberatory education and pedagogy. So solidarity has always been what inspires me most. To not understand myself as an individual, as an isolated incident, but as part of a whole, right? To be part of a collective experience and collective responsibility to one another in the world. It's why organizing is so important, to build power in communities that are exploited and oppressed, to see the relationship between your fate and the fate of others. That's actually how social change happens. That is our best protection against state violence and exploitation. You know, solidarity really cultivates our ability for change and real democracy, working alongside one another, defending one another, articulating what we want and our desires and needs for ordinary people, connecting our struggles, our hopes, and our futures, right? And how we do that, we organize. We come up with visions for what we want, and we figure out a plan to get there. And we make sure that we're led by those most impacted by those decisions, by those policies, because those most impacted have the answers. They have the most to lose and they have the most to gain, right? So I want to give a few examples of some victories that inspire me and continue to give me hope in what's possible in the coming days. When our youth and parents identified language access as a key issue for our community in San Francisco, they wanted to organize to get Arabic to be offered as a second language in public schools in San Francisco Unified School District. There were already over a dozen other world language pathway programs that are already offered. In the process of recognizing that that's something they wanted to work on and as a key issue, they also recognized that the growing Vietnamese community in San Francisco also didn't have Vietnamese offered as a second language. So we launched a campaign collectively with the Vietnamese community to get Arabic and Vietnamese as a language offered in public schools. And the Board of Education was overwhelmingly in support. Why wouldn't they be? You know, we mobilized hundreds of families to advocate for this and to speak on their own behalf as to why this was important to them. And they passed the resolution to get Arabic and Vietnamese taught in K through 12 schools in San Francisco. Soon after, we faced right-wing attacks from pro-Israel interest groups, including the Anti-Defamation League and the Jewish Community Relations Council, who smeared AROC, who targeted our youth, who plastered their photos on mainstream media, the front pages calling them anti-Semitic, including myself, and through who political pressure had the district cave to demands to stall the implementation of the language pathway, because supposedly teaching Arabic and partnering with AROC could endanger students, right? So this Islamophobic and racist attack was horrendous and took 3 years to overcome. However, in those 3 years, despite the district launching an investigation against AROC, despite the district stopping our youth programming in the high schools for 3 years, and despite the district stalling Arabic language pathway, the Bay Area and across the country, people showed up in solidarity. Communities organizing to fight for justice in housing, immigration, education, against policing, those fighting against Islamophobia, homophobia, racism, and sexism, all mobilized in the thousands over those years to call on San Francisco to reject the attack on Arabs and Muslims and on Arabic and AROC. The decision makers had to choose. What side of history are they going to be on? And after 3 years of having to defend a victory to simply teach Arabic in schools, after 3 years of vitriol from the right wing, we won. Because on one side, you had all those at the receiving end of racism and oppression. And on the other side, you had all those who benefit from it, right? And so we were able to really expose the contradiction for itself. And now Arabic and Vietnamese are taught in San Francisco. Arabic is taught in elementary, middle, and high school. And our Arab youth are now offered and supported by AROC's programming across the district. That's what's possible with solidarity and joint struggle. It's similar to what we see with the statewide campaign in California around ethnic studies to defend against right-wing attacks. Again, the same forces, the same pro-Israeli interest groups, including the Jewish Legislative Caucus, have chosen to target an anti-racist liberatory discipline of ethnic studies, right? Ethnic studies emerged as a discipline that decenters whiteness and centers the stories and struggles of racialized and indigenous people. The founders of ethnic studies, who led the longest student strike in US history, did so in order to open up educational institutions to our histories, to our cultures, to our communities, and other racialized and oppressed people. And since the Black Student Union and Third World Liberation strikes of 1968 and 69, scholars and activists had advanced the field of ethnic studies, implementing it in universities and schools across the country, including teaching about Palestine, right? And today in the California Department of Education, they have decided that right-wing interest groups should dictate what ethnic studies is, what stories are told, what stories are erased, just like we've seen in the systemic educational system across the country for decades and since the founding of this country. And why? Because of the inclusion of Palestine. As a result, we have built a multiracial coalition demanding that our students deserve better than that, and that right-wing groups and politicians shouldn't determine the future of education in California and set a precedent for the rest of the country. The solidarity that we have built through this work and during this struggle will outlast any policy, will outlast any shelved curriculum, and will shape the future of what is possible for our communities in this moment and in what's possible tomorrow. If we're committed to building a new society, if we're committed to a new people, a new person, where all people, regardless of your privilege, your status, your religion, or class, can live towards your fullest potential, then we have to understand that that act is not bounded by any ethnic identity, any national identity, any geographic border, any social construct. It's bounded by joint struggle and solidarity. And that's how we make change. It's not only a moral imperative to act in solidarity and the human rights of all people, it's actually necessary if we want to win. Our opposition understands that. That's why they coordinate so well together. That's why they have shared interests. That's how they consolidate power to exploit more people, to extract more resources. And as we've witnessed with the global rise of fascism, we're seeing that continue. And we need to do the same in order to shift power, right? We need to build power and defend people collectively. Very simply put, I believe that the practice of solidarity is what makes change possible. And it's not just about parallels and comparisons. It's about our shared visions and liberation projects and collective strategies, right? So it's a project. Building on the hope that Tiffany just spoke so eloquently about, I'm inspired by how we're all continuing down this path, continuing to not only speak truth to power, but exert our own power in the face of oppressive power, to demand more and dream more and fight for what is possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Lara. Thank you for that powerful presentation, and also, highlighting the importance of solidarity and an agency within ourselves and our students and our community within these discussions. So thank you so much. Next, we have Theresa.
Thank you. Always want to unmute. It was an extremely powerful exercise just preparing for this presentation. When you're asked to reflect on the power of your culture, the strength of, for me, Chicano-Latino lazos that bind me as a people, and then to consider how to create possibility for collective action in ways that connect us all, that to me is the power of what we have within this conversation. So I want to thank you for folks' willingness to listen, and for NAAWA for the possibility of participating in this. So when I begin my journey, and when I begin to talk about my self-discovery and exploration, I have to begin miles away in a barrio called Florencia, right? Which we grew up it being called F13. And it was located in South LA, right in the middle of the Black community on one end of the railroad tracks, and then white community on the other end of the railroad tracks. Here's this little spot of about, what I later learned was about 10,000 Mexican Americans growing up together. And as I was preparing for this presentation, I decided, well, let me Google my neighborhood and see what I found. And the thing that came I came upon in Googling it was the words Los Angeles's deadliest gang, right? That's what appeared in the text below this picture of these vatos, some of which I grew up with going by. So I was born in a working class Chicano family, and I like to tell folks I was Union before I was Chicana. We never ate grapes. We never crossed a picket line. I was always reminded by my dad, who was a member of the Bakery and Confectionery Workers of LA Local 37, right, that what we had was thanks to the union. We were the only family on the block who owned our home. We're the only family that had health insurance. But nonetheless, I later learned that we happen to live in the poorest area of LA County. And I remember one day sitting in class at Florence Avenue School, and this well-meaning substitute was trying to engage us in a conversation about the conditions in the surrounding neighborhood, and proceeded to explain to us that we were poor, right? So, we were impressionable young Mexican American and Black students, because that's what my classroom was made up of, but we weren't stupid. So when she turned around and said, well, how many of you here are poor? We all kind of listened politely, glanced at one another and these little puzzled faces, smiled, and then just whispered to one another, what is she talking about? We're not poor. Right? This teacher had made these assumptions that because me and my fellow classmates lived in this really poor community, she assumed based on our income and our phenotype, she verbalized out loud her preconceived deficit perspective that we were uneducable because we were poor, brown, Black, and minority. And that to me is like this deficit belief that many in education have, that the root cause of educational achievement is due to a deficiency in students whose phenotype, language, and class are not reflective in the dominant culture. Deficit theory blames the victim, and then conversely tries to work on those students so that they fit in, right? So you don't only label these students as deficient, but then you begin to design educational programs aimed to remediate the problem, the language problem, right? The problem that they can't write academic language, right? You begin to change their language. You begin to erase and revise their history. You support their immigrant status, not by supporting their immigrant status, but by demeaning that and working towards assimilation. So that was what constructed my experiences in school, right? The Alamo and Ferdinand the Bull. That's how I saw my experience in school. I was bothered by these negative images. I was bothered by the negative Google, right? And so I said, well, no, that's not what my neighborhood was all about, right? So where did we learn about who we are? And so I started to think about what was a positive image about growing up on 71st and Holmes in South LA. And I immediately conjured up this image of the Virgen de Guadalupe, right? She's the Virgin Guadalupe that adorns this bakery. It's still there, some almost 50 years later, this image of the Virgin Mary with the Mexican flag on the corner of Florence and Holmes. And painted, by the way, by that deadliest gang in LA, right? And I remember recalling it with a sense of pride, because it represented a couple of things. It represented culture, it represented community, it represented spirit, but the Virgin de Guadalupe and the UFW also represented social justice and movements. And that's what gave me my inspiration. So I began to realize that the inability of Latinos not succeeding in school isn't about our culture. It isn't because we're poor. It isn't because we don't speak English. It isn't because our parents don't place a high value on education. Because even under the worst situation, our parents believe that access to quality education will guarantee their children the economic stability that many could only dream of. It's our parents who undid the deficit narratives that many of us faced. And I remember finding my first voice was in a high school history class when we were studying. This was years later when we were studying, it was actually in a Latin American history class that we had fought for, taught by a white, well-meaning teacher, who began to talk about, again, the Mexican-American War and the Alamo. My mother immediately said, well, what about the Niños Héroes? you go in there and you tell them about those 7 boys that wrapped themselves in the Mexican flag and threw themselves off the Castillo de Chapultepec. Whenever they raise the Alamo, you raise the Castillo de Chapultepec. So it was in high school that I became Chicana, right? And that was a label to define at that point these conflicting worlds of being Mexican and being American, right? It was a term used to describe this power relationship that controls the lives, not just of Chicanas, but of all bicultural populations in the US, right? It's a political term to explain my politics and my identity. And accepting the word Chicana, you embrace the inherent activism and social justice leanings that label applies, right? You're subject to the social construct of race, language, gender, and historical oppression. These are the spaces of the Southwest US and the metaphorical spaces of racial intersectionality, the hybrid of multiple identities that I embrace today. And along with that carries a personal responsibility to critical analyze the societal context that Chicanos, Latinos, other marginalized communities negotiate, and how the system has created and negatively impacted our communities. It isn't something we did. It was something that was instituted and placed upon us. And our responsibility is to make sure that changes. It was in high school and college when I started to work with Asian, Black, and Chicano pride that I began to realize, well, we ain't gonna be able to change these social conditions by ourselves. You know, Chicano movement's good, right? Hey, I'm all for the Chicano movement, right? But I began to realize that we're not gonna change these social and political conditions in South LA, in California, in the US, without beginning to engage in a global struggle against this marginalization. And that's when I began to realize the idea of solidarity. And as I sit here today, I can't help but to acknowledge how those same forces that push back on ethnic studies when we started this work, on those same forces who told us that we were worthless, right? That we were going to become, that our culture demeaned our culture and our language, negated our history, that those same forces are now moving to consolidate power in education once again. Public schools are commodities tied to marketplace educational reform, and the battle for ethnic studies has become a wedge issue for educational justice in California. The battle for ethnic studies that's being waged simultaneously with the Black Lives Matter movement, right? So as a Chicana who believes not only in what's in the best interest of her community, immigration, language, education, economic stability, I also have to educate my people, right? And part of that is making sure that my students recognize the importance of the Black Lives Matter movement, of dealing with issues of colorism within our community from elementary school to high school, right? But in the ethnic studies struggle, it's also, and I learned this actually when I participated in the Jackson campaign, because prior to that, I had no political education on what Palestine was. It was during the Jesse Jackson campaign that I met other Palestinian women, other Arab women, right? I had worked with African-American women. I had worked with others in the Asian community through my work in college. But it was then that I began to listen to the stories of others, right? And to connect those stories to the colonization and manifest destiny that we experience. And today, that is what I'm experiencing in the struggle for ethnic studies. Not allowing the state of California to pit us against each other and say to one group, well, we didn't touch your part of the model curriculum, so you should be pleased and tickled pink and happy and ready to implement it. But we will we will marginalize Arab American studies and Palestinian voices. And you should be okay with that because that's not your people, right? That's not happening to you. Well, I'm here to tell you that it is. It is happening to me, and it is happening to my students. Because whenever you marginalize anyone, you marginalize all of us. And so that's how I want to kind of end this discussion, because for us to collectively reimagine a public education classroom as a space of joy and creativity and community responsiveness and authentic curriculum means that we're going to have to bring together and merge all of our histories of resilience and resistance, all of our desires to speak our languages and have our cultures respected, and all of our desires to have every student have the right to an authentic ethnic studies education. We have to move beyond this dream of thinking what it could possibly be and recognize that it can happen. If we build alliances with one another, we can and will develop a richer, more humane, democratic society. If we roll up our sleeves, mess up our hair just a little bit, move on out there, we can make the difference. And we have to do it. We must do it because the challenge facing us is too important. And the opportunity at hand to make it better is too wonderful and too great an opportunity to pass up.
Wow, thank you so much, Teresa. That was beautiful. And can I just say, I feel extremely privileged and honored to be sharing this space with all three of you. You all are so inspiring. I'm seeing so many comments in the chat box from folks feeling so inspired and hopeful and just really commending you for the work that you do and the stories that you've shared. So we really appreciate that. Thank you. And I love, Dr. Patterson, what you just wrote. Solidarity is a verb. That's a great line. So now I think we can go ahead and go into question and answer time with our audience. I already see some folks have submitted questions into the chat box. So please feel free to submit questions, and you can also direct them to a specific panelist if you would like. Otherwise, we'll just address it to the panel. So I guess we can go ahead and let me just filter through these. Okay, so we have a question from Ilham, who's asking, as we look at, and I think this can go to, I think this is directed towards you, Dr. Mitchell Patterson. As we look into creating alliances, what do you think we can do as women's organizations and marginalized group of Arab Americans to reach more to African American communities and others? What can we do better as Arab Americans who some think are white, including Arabs themselves? So I think, yeah.
Big question, but I'll say this. I think first that there have been examples of this. So, in thinking about the work in Black feminism, you do see a lot of this solidarity across. But into that kind of latter point is white supremacy and anti-Black racism is very pervasive. And it's pervasive in all this, some people want to ascribe to whiteness, and this is their survival tactic, right? So I think a big part of this is that education, not just within the Arab community, but also within the Black community, right? It's really important that we think about the ways in which white supremacy has filtered through all of these things and has normalized it without teaching about either one of our communities. And then making sure that we can have space where we're talking to each other, because this solidarity, while it's a verb, is quite difficult, right? Because you have to negotiate with each other and you have to think about the interests, and it could be difficult. And sometimes when, there's a lot of state sanctioned violence that's highly visible occurring, not saying it's not happening in other communities, because it is, but then it's highly visible with one particular community. So I think particularly with women, in a women's organization, that intersectionality piece, both facing overlapping oppressions, and how can we advocate for issues that do face not just women, but in particular issues related to us, whether that is class related, whether it's reproductive health, whether it's climate justice. I think there's a lot of inroads that can be made definitely across communities and not just between those two communities. But we do have to also address that, and specific to the Black community, that anti-Black racism that does tend to occur, and how to uproot that, how to name it first, push through the discomfort, and really do that critical work. And I think that education, but I think we do see models. We see how BLM and the Palestinian movement since 2012 has been, intricately linked. We see that work happening, and there's a lot of Black, I know in college, being a part of resistance movements and advocating for Palestine in college amongst Black students. And so I think there are elements there within the culture that can link in and reside in, but we have to think about how we can tackle some big things, like some pervasive things that have been normalized, and then also find some of that, like others were saying, this interest that, we can kind of mobilize around that impact us all. That's just my 2 cents on a very quick answer that probably could be its own session.
No, that was fantastic, and that was really helpful. Thank you, and thank you for drawing on the fact that these both of our communities and struggles. I'm Palestinian myself, and we have a long, deep history of working together in joint struggles. I do want to give Lara also a chance to touch on this question. I know in her work at AROC, you do a lot of work in organizing with youth, with different communities, and might have some insight to share too.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Tiffany, for really laying the groundwork for what it means to really push our own communities, right, around these issues, because there's a work to do within our communities, there's work to do across our communities. And also, Janeen, for talking about the history of that solidarity. This isn't new. We're not coming up with ideas of how to build with one another. This is a tradition within liberation movements that we understood ourselves as internationalists, right? And really our struggles as linked. I think as it relates specifically between Black and Arab American communities and movements, there's long history of struggle with our movements. That doesn't mean that our communities and families all understand that, right? So we have to also do the deep work, not just the wide work of just like reaching out across, but also like, how are we talking to our parents, our cousins, our aunties, our uncles about these issues? And I think this last year really gave us an opportunity to have very difficult conversations that I feel like I haven't seen as much in the Arab and Palestinian bases that we work with on an everyday, right? So we do a lot of work to talk about, why are Arabs liquor store owners? Why is there a corner store in every Black and brown community that's owned by an Arab? What does that mean? What role does that play? How do the cops and others actually reward Arabs for surveilling other people of color, right? How are they pitting us against each other? And these are the conversations we need to have. And that's, I think, if we can have those difficult conversations and acknowledge that the root of this is racial capitalism, right? So we get rewarded for harming one another. The state actually wants us to surveil one another, wants us to police one another, wants us to collaborate with those who enforce racist policies and laws. And by doing so, we get rewarded. If we don't, we get punished, right? And so this is the conversation that needs to be had, is what do we gain if we move beyond that framework? And I've seen so much really beautiful solidarity over the last year, especially where people are talking about anti-Black racism within all communities, and also not invisibilizing our own Black siblings, right? So it's not like there's not Black Palestinians or Black Arabs within the SWANA community. So we need to understand ourselves as complex and nuanced, and an anti-Black racism, as was mentioned earlier, is not a US-based thing. It's a global issue. It's a structural issue. And it's just like every other system of oppression requires that deep political education to understand it and real struggle to overcome it. And there's so many countless examples of how that's been done with people in Gaza and in Palestine, tweeting to people in Ferguson, this is how you deal with tear gas, right? And then continuing down till now, where we have such deep solidarity across our communities, where it's not just about saying, please stand in solidarity with Arab American studies, please show up for us. It's saying by you attacking Palestine and Arab American studies, you are attacking all of us, like Theresa said, right? It's not just saying that I want you to show up for me and therefore I will show up for you. Solidarity isn't a transaction. It's understanding with our youth when they ask young folks to show up for them for Arabic in the schools, they also understand that when Coleman Advocates or Chinese Progressive Association or other organizations we work very closely with are mobilizing against police violence, that is also their issue because they're also impacted by police violence, and that we're really all in this together. I think if we can have those hard conversations, but also be grounded in the history of solidarity that we come from and understand this isn't new, and that believe in the courage to struggle, that a lot can be done. And I feel very inspired by what we've already seen. And then just in terms of the question of whiteness and Arab Americans and their proximity to whiteness, that's not a flat experience. Again, there are Black Arabs, right? So we also don't want to discount that. But at the same time, we need to understand white supremacy is also global. And so that's something we all have to work against. And that's why Arabs want to be white. And it's also a class issue. So what is the different experience of upper class Arabs from working and poor and working class Arabs? All of that is really how identity is shaped and formed and how you relate and experience oppression. And if we can have those hard conversations and teach our young people to think about that and unpack it, so much can be made possible.
Thank you both. And I think that question just speaks directly as to why what we're talking about today in education is so important, and our youth and our young people learn our histories from our perspectives in schools. So we have another question for you, Dr. Montano. And sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Please correct me. But
right that time.
Okay. Okay, so here we go. How can schools close the gap and teachers understand how to embrace students from other communities or immigrants?
Oh my gosh, that is a tall challenge. And I saw the other question about the changing it to assets. So it's kind of the same.
Yeah.
I see a lot of approaches out there. In fact, I'm doing a workshop next week on changing deficit to assets-based conversations. But there are some approaches that look at it like through data collection and don't really look at it through community cultural wealth or the strengths within the community itself. So I think that one of the things in terms of deficit perspectives is that I have found, and I've done this quite a long time, is that many times educators who make deficit comments don't really look at it as systemic, or don't look at how their comments and their perspectives are enabling systemic marginalization of BIPOC students. So I think that's the first thing we have to do, is get them to recognize that words are not just words, thoughts are not just thoughts, right? They perpetuate a system that creates this marginalization. Once you do that, the best way to change the educational system is to engage in some of the things that Lara was saying earlier, in educational projects for social justice, engaging youth in projects to change educational systems, right? To do youth participatory action research, to work on critical projects. Ethnic studies is one of the things that will do this. There is so much that needs to be changed in order for that to happen. And there are so many places to begin. It's going to take a while to actually begin to change the educational system, but we can do it. And I think ethnic studies is a start. I think anti-racist education is a start.
And I'd love to jump in on that if possible, just a little bit, to even talk about how this whole gap and notion of a gap is problematic and racist and systemic in itself. And it totally dehumanizes and devalues the knowledge that students of color, immigrant youth are bringing, and so I think it's so important for teachers in engaging this work, not just, oh, I'm a teacher, I love children, and I want to do a cute Pinterest board, right? This is really seeing your children. This is humanizing them. This is doing that critical pre-work on yourself, because the reality is the teaching force is predominantly white. And so this is work that they're going to have to really do, to unlearning work that they're going to have to do. I think also diversifying the teaching force, but then that also there should be more pathways in teacher preparation and teacher education to be able to do this work as well. In teacher preparation, there may be one multicultural education class, and check the box. That's a problem. So I think there's systemic problems at different levels in how we engage teachers into doing this work.
And actually building off of that, I have a quick question. I know, Tiffany, you mentioned in the beginning, I think you work with an organization called Teachers for Social Justice. A lot of our members or folks watching today are based in the DMV. Could you just quickly talk about that? Because I think that directly relates to what we're discussing today.
Absolutely. In the DC area, there's a DC Area Educators for Social Justice. It is a group that is under Teaching for Change. You may have seen their website in terms of social justice books, where they have curated book lists. DC Area Educators, they have several different organizing working committees, some on early childhood education, some on people's history, some on Black Lives Matter at school. There's also challenging Islamophobia as a threat within Teaching for Change research and work and advocacy work. And teachers are simply meeting up, looking at curriculum, organizing themselves. Just 3 weeks ago, they had a virtual curriculum fair for Black Lives Matter at school with Howard University. So it's a great way to become a part of and just get resources and also get critical feedback on your lessons. Many ways you're trying to do this work, particularly if it's outside of an identity that you see yourself as, and wanting to make sure you're doing this and honoring that the people that you're representing and the work in the classroom. So DC Area Educators for Social Justice, I'll put the link in the chat so that you all can see and get connected with them.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And so we have a question, and I guess this can maybe go to you, Lara. What is the status of the ethnic studies model curriculum?
I can speak to, but I actually want to defer to Theresa, since she was a writer of the original ethnic studies model curriculum. I can speak about action steps and how people can support. But maybe Theresa, do you want to cover just where things are at, given that you are part of why we're here?
Yes. Okay, so the state of California is on its third iteration of the ethnic studies model curriculum framework. In its iteration, this final iteration, it's actually gotten to be less and less ethnic studies and much more a multicultural, and I wouldn't even go that far, but US history course. The Arab American studies section that we worked so hard to make sure was placed in the Asian American studies section has now been moved to what they call a bridge section. Nobody else has a bridge section, right? But ethnic studies does, which is insulting because it basically says ethnic studies educators need to be told how to build alliances in the classroom. So it's in this bridge section along with a Jewish studies lesson and a few other lessons that they put in this section called the bridge section. Our work right now is to continue to push back on the CDE, the Department of Education, to make sure that the Arab American Studies lesson, which has been, in my estimation, really diminished from the power of the original lesson plans, right? But it's still sitting here. We want it back in Asian American Studies, where it belongs, where it belongs. We also are concerned that some of the terms and terminology has been radically changed not to reflect authentic ethnic studies. For example, they have two definitions of racism, right? One of them, which we've used in the field as race as a social construct, which most anti-racist and ethnic studies educators agree with. And another that was put in there by someone who didn't understand race as a social construct. So she wanted to put in a definition that talked about race as a biological construct, which we have all dismissed. So at this point, it's going to the State Department, the school board, the California School Board Association is the next level of approval. They have until April to approve this model, and then this model will be disseminated to districts. It will not be, districts will not be forced to use it. They can still develop their own ethnic studies curriculum, but many districts will use it because they don't have anything. And then we've also started several other projects in light of what we see happening in the state of California, the disappointment and discouraging things they're doing. And then I'll let Laura talk about the action step.
Yeah, I put in the chat a link that lists all the different ways that people can support and take action. And essentially what this is, where we're at now, is pro-Israeli interest groups have succeeded in gutting ethnic studies altogether. And the concern now is when local teachers and practitioners in the classroom want to teach with the fidelity of an ethnic studies course or lesson, that they can now be reprimanded, or the work that has been done across the state to really advance ethnic studies and across the country is being rolled back by these biological definitions of race, by the conflation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, which is referenced in the curriculum. The very fact that Arab American studies has been relegated to an appendix alongside what is really an Israeli lesson plan is not only insulting, it's colonial and goes against everything ethnic studies stands for. So the concern is what precedent this will set for the rest of the country. I know many of the viewers are not in California, but we see this as a terrain of struggle for racial justice across the country. Because if they succeed in gutting ethnic studies with this model curriculum, rolling back the work of practitioners and movements for decades, and conflating Palestine solidarity, or actually making Palestine solidarity criminal and criminalized, especially for a teacher, what does that mean for teachers and students in the coming days? And actually it goes against everything ethnic studies stands for. We had a webinar recently with Dr. Angela Davis and practitioners and scholars and experts like Theresa, where there was consensus that this is not ethnic studies, but most importantly, that there's solidarity around what we need to do to fight back. So I have put the link in the chat and encourage everyone to learn about what's possible for your local districts. We're happy to support with resources. There is an effort to develop a real liberatory ethnic studies model curriculum that Theresa is helping lead, and that can be a resource for all of you across the country as you try to teach liberatory education and pedagogy in your classroom.
And I would love to just add on a few things that I have done with students to be in solidarity with that movement in Washington, D.C. and Arlington. You can teach Banned Books Week. You could teach about ethnic studies and what it is and why we need that. You can. We had students write letters like when what was happening in Tucson, Arizona, and Mexican American studies, and students here rallied around with letters of support. And so you can also engage students outside of California to do that work, but then also saying, okay, what's happening here? And why don't we can be both and I think that's a great way for students to really be in a struggle, doing things like taking a picture with a book that's banned and having students and reading and engaging that work and say, why don't you want to teach this history, my history, and history of peoples of color? So I think that's a great way to make connections when you are not specifically in that fight, but showing solidarity and support. Because again, as we keep saying, this is a verb. This is something we got to work at. And, I'm down with all power to all people. So we got to make sure that we're in the movement for anything that's oppressive.
I think our struggle right now is who gets to define what ethnic studies is, right? And it is moving to the local area. So I think we've been fighting it on a statewide level, but these forces, these pro-Israeli forces are following us into districts. And that's the concern. And that's why so many teachers are worried about what happens when I do want to implement an authentic ethnic studies classes? How are these right-wing organizations going to influence my district and push me away from teaching authentic ethnic studies? And we're seeing it in districts, many districts wanting to really water down the curriculum because of their fear about what's going to happen to us. And so I also put in the chat, one of the good things that has resulted from California is whenever there's, pushback and oppression, there is resistance, right? And there is organizing and there is solidarity. So one of the positive things has resulted in our fight for ethnic studies was the development of this Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum Consortium, which is comprised by the members of the Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum Advisory Committee, many of them, but also by members of the American Indian education community and other communities that have come together to actually develop a stronger, people from Arizona, some folks who were involved in the struggle in Tucson and are now in California are a part of the Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum. And so we've been hosting institutes. We'll have a summer institute. We had 70 educators at our last one, and that was because we kept people out. So we know that there is this desire and this want for authentic ethnic studies. So that website is up there. In about 2 months, we'll have lesson plans up there from K through high school that you can use. We're actually doing presentations in school districts and schools, and they are among the most highly regarded ethnic studies folks in the state of California. 50 quality, authentic ethnic studies educators.
That's fantastic. Thank you for those updates, and also just sharing some real tangible actions that folks in their community can do and teachers can do to, support the ethnic studies fight, and also just to ensure that we don't have a similar situation in other communities that we're all facing. So I think I'm now looking at our time and seeing that we are about almost at time, and I want to give each of the panelists a chance to give closing remarks and any last statements or anything that you would like to share, and wrapping up our discussion today. Oh, and also I do see Yada just added NAAWA's social media handles and our website in the chat box. So please be sure to go there for any updates and follow up with our speakers and things that are taking place in NAAWA's events. But now I would like to give our speakers a chance to give closing remarks. And I guess we can go in the same order that we opened in. So Tiffany, please.
First, I just want to say that my heart is so full and my soul is rejuvenated every time I'm in solidarity with and in community with people doing the work. And I just want to really stress upon that there are a lot of educators doing the work in spite of. There's a lot of educators not doing it, but there are a lot that are doing this very critical work and believe in this work and are willing to sacrifice. And there's a lot of young people that are also pushing for this work. And I want to make sure that we acknowledge the role of young people in saying, we want our history and we want it now. Classrooms can be a site of change. And this is very deep, personal work. It's difficult, it's complex, it's messy. And that's how we should also present it to students. We don't need to give them this glossed over, watered down, reduced, whitewashed type of curriculum or ideas about this. Like, this is a struggle. It's titled struggle for a reason, but it's also a beautiful struggle to be in community and to be in solidarity and to get small victories and to take some losses and to regroup and to go back and doing this work, because each generation is going to take things a bit further, and incremental change is very important change. And so be encouraged, continue to learn, do that deep personal reflection on political work and education within yourself, within your spheres of influence, and also connecting with others doing this work more broadly. And so I will leave with that I just believe in revolution. Like I said, education is my revolution, but it's yours too. And we're all in this struggle together. And it's a lifelong journey. So thank you for having me. I think we're going to continue to, as you know, the movie's coming out today is Fred Hampton and talking about that, and that's going to be all the buzz. But in his work, we beat racism with solidarity, and then that's what we're going to do, and we're going to beat all the isms with that. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you, NAAWA, for hosting this important conversation. I'm inspired by the energy from our community who really want to continue to engage in the terrain of education as a liberatory terrain, a place that can actually transform people's lives and communities. And we've seen it happen. I saw a question about what communities have stood in solidarity with Arab American studies, and I want to just end by answering that question, which is all communities. So if you want to find hope in this moment, and if you are discouraged by the onslaught of attacks on all our people globally, not just here in the United States, just rest assured that people who are impacted, people who are struggling together. The webinar we just hosted that I mentioned earlier by the Save Arab American Studies Coalition included every community. Every community was there to say we stand not only in solidarity with Palestine and Arab American Studies, we stand in joint struggle with one another in this fight. And it's really just those who benefit from our oppression that are not on our side, which makes all the sense in the world, right? So ultimately we are in good company, and to know that you are in good company and that wherever you are listening in or watching this webinar from, to just look into what programs, campaigns, efforts exist in your local area, who's doing that good work, what organizations are doing that good work, build with them, learn from them, and try to advance that forward. And if there's any way we could support as the Save Arab American Studies Coalition or AROC, we are ready and willing. Thank you again for having us.
So every time, and Lara's absolutely right, it's all communities supporting this struggle. And what's interesting is that for me and for many of us, it's the first time we've actually ever been confronted with the kind of ugliness that comes with some of the attacks. And all it does is strengthen our resolve. So I know in many times, when we have this saying, or it's actually not a saying, there's this Mexican rock band called Los Enanitos Verdes, right? And they have this song, and I'll say it in Spanish and then translate it, because it's what I use to kind of pick myself up every time there is an attack. And it's de levantarse y seguir cayendo, pero hay que correr al riesgo, de levantarse y seguir cayendo. And it's like, actually just pick yourself up and continue to fall. But when you pick yourself up, you're just gonna, take the risk and keep on running, and then pick yourself up and continue to fall. And I think that's the story of our lives, and that's the story of our struggle. The difference is, and the beauty of it is that every time you take that step and you fall down, there are 3 or 4 other people ready to give you a hand and say, come on, let me pick you up and stand with me. And that's the beauty of this work. And that's the beauty of this conversation. I am so thrilled to have met Tiffany and want to keep in touch. We both do teacher prep, so that's going to be really important. Thank you. And I know I'll see others along the road to justice.
Wow, thank you so much. Thank you to all the panelists. You all gave such inspiring and hopeful presentations in the face of such a difficult and long struggle, with a history of a long struggle. I think it's so important that we remember we're doing this work because we are communities who love life. We're communities who want our children to be uplifted and to have a complete, comprehensive life, and be able to enjoy that, from education to everything in this world that has to offer. So thank you from sharing your perspectives and experiences. We appreciate your time. And thank you to all, everybody who joined this webinar today and took your Friday afternoon to have a conversation with NAAWA. We're really excited for future events. Please be sure to check out our website and social media, like mentioned, to see how you can stay involved. So with that, I think we'll close out. Have a great weekend.
Peace, everyone. Thank you.